Well, good morning, folks. My name is McEnroe. I'm the Director of Public Relations for the Boston Foundation. Mary Jo Meisner was scheduled to moderate this panel. She had another commitment, but she and I have something in common, which is we're both recovering journalists, or we've crossed over the dark side, depending on how you want to look at it. I joined the Boston Foundation about 6 months ago, and from a career in broadcast journalism, I've spent nearly 2 decades working for television newsrooms in places from Tallahassee, Florida, to Portland, Maine, Hartford, Connecticut, and for the last 7 years I've been at New England Cable News, where I was initially the executive producer for newscasts, first in the morning, then the evening, and then 3 years ago, about 3.5 years actually, it would have been 4 years that I stayed. I ran the digital properties for NECN.com, so the website, social media, digital newsletters, that sort of thing. And coming to the Boston Foundation from NECN was actually really interesting to me because it was a real opportunity to begin to look more in depth at data. One of the first things I got to do when I arrived was actually work with Barry Bluestone, a presentation of the annual housing report that Barry and his team does for the foundation. And of course, I had the opportunity to work closely with Charlotte on the poverty report released last fall, and also the upcoming next round of the Boston Indicators Project. And for those of you out there who are data geeks, how we put it when everyone arrived this morning, the good news from a media perspective is that there's a lot more data geeks getting involved on the media side than we've had in quite some time. 2012 is really an opportunity and a promising year for data journalism. Just even looking at the last few months, the Online News Association conference was here in Boston in September, and one of the hot topics there was talking about open data and new sources of data and how can journalists use that data more effectively. Just this month, the beta launch of the Panda Project, which is an open source platform for journalists to collaborate and share data sets that they've gathered from around the country in one central location. And you may have seen last week that Google and the Global Editors Network have created the first ever Data Journalism Awards, with awards for data-driven investigations, interactive data visualizations, and data-driven mobile or web applications and services. And in creating the award, they were asked, what's the purpose of doing this? And the goals are pretty simple: to contribute to the setting high standards and highlighting best practices in data journalism, and to demonstrate the value of data journalism among editors and media executives. And of course, that is a lot of what we're trying to do today with this panel on engaging the media to tell your community stories. And so the first thing I want to do is introduce this panel that we have. We've got a great mix of people here. Starting on my immediate left, Maggie Mulvihill is the co-director and senior investigative producer for the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. She's an award-winning journalist with more than 20 years of experience in both print and broadcast reporting in New England, specializing in investigative work. You'll find the 20 years theme is in common here. Next to her is John Davidow, the executive editor of WBUR.org, which is one of the leading websites for national public radio for local stations. And for 2011, actually, WBUR.org won the Edward R. Murrow Award for the best large market radio website, commercial or non-commercial, in the entire nation. He joined BUR in 2003 as news director and managing editor before making a brilliant move over to the digital side.
Blue antenna.
He spent more than 20 years as a journalist. Next to him, Derrick Jackson is a columnist for the Boston Globe, perhaps best recognized from data circles for his annual focus on the NCAA and graduation rates for student athletes, where he really digs into those numbers to look at the graduation gap and other gaps between white and black athletes. He's been a Globe columnist for more than 20 years. And on the end, Mark Abraham is the one person on this panel who doesn't come from sort of a traditional media organization. He's the executive director of DataHaven, a National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership affiliated nonprofit that has been compiling and sharing public information as a service to Greater New Haven for more than 20 years.
He's not even 20.
Really? He started when he was 5.
Exactly.
And so Mark's role here is both as someone who works with media on a regular basis to share data stories, and also Mark has developed following on his own Twitter account, Urban Data. More than 9,000 people follow that account as he shares data stories from across the country. So that's who we have here. And what I wanted to do to start was just give each of our panel members a chance to talk a little bit from their perspectives about how they're using data and how data is driving their coverage. And we'll start with Maggie. Probably comes at this from the most traditional perspective. One thing I wanted to note as well, if you are tweeting with the hashtag DataDay and you have a question, if you're whether watching on the live stream or you just kind of don't want to put your hand up and talk on the microphone, if you could use a cue at the beginning of it, so I'll see those come up as we get to the Q&A section.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Hi, I'm Maggie Mulvihill. I'm the co-founder and the co-director of the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. We are a nonprofit investigative reporting newsroom that's based at Boston University. And I run it with a longtime television reporter, Joe Bergantino, who maybe some of you have heard of. I'm so happy to be here. And when I heard about this last December, I immediately signed up. And I actually feel like an old veteran in this because I started working with data over a decade ago when I was learning how to write queries in Access. And this year, to show you how far things have changed, I'm going to a conference next month on computer-assisted reporting, which I teach, and I'm learning how to do Django and Python to write web apps. So these are the kinds of things that really are essential skills for any journalist today, and I hammer that into my students because all the job listings that I see for the kind of reporting that I want to do, which is public service journalism, accountability journalism, keeping the powerful accountable, requires data skills, whether it's Excel to, scraping social media. So at our center, almost everything that we do uses public records and frequently data sets, and we're part of a new, it's really not a new movement in journalism, but it's got some new terms. Journalytics is one of the terms that we now, some of us who are data geeks that like to write news fall into. There's another term that applies to us called editorial developers. And it's funny, when Google announced their awards, it is being, labeled the first data journalism award. That's not correct. We shared in a data journalism award last year for a story that we did on campus sexual assaults, in which we used Justice Department data to show that colleges and universities across New England were not punishing kids found responsible for rape on campus. It was extremely flawed data, but we did, with the Center for Public Integrity, with whom we work a lot, share in what's called the Precision Journalism Award. It's a national award given out by the University of Missouri for data-driven projects. So anyway, I was so thrilled to hear about this, and I really think that I was surprised that more journalists weren't here because we really are working with data all of the time. And there are challenges for journalists using data, especially in Massachusetts, I think. We recently did a story on juveniles serving life without parole that ran on the front page of the Globe a few weeks ago. This is a big national issue. The Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments next month on whether it's unconstitutional to sentence kids as young as 14 to life without parole. And we started the project last year, and we looked everywhere across the state of Massachusetts for data on what kids between the ages of 14 and 16 were being charged with murder in only a 15-year time period, and how their cases were disposed of. And prosecutors had no way of giving it to us. One prosecutor sent us a bill for $55,000 to collect the records. So our kids built a completely unique data set from just shoe leather reporting, knocking on doors, interviews, pulling court records, press releases, and we were able to confirm some of that data with the Massachusetts Sentencing Commission, but they couldn't give us any names because of Quarry laws. But we were able to tell a really powerful story about how the life without parole sentence in Massachusetts is being applied unevenly, inconsistently, and it's not capturing the super predators that it was designed to punish. So often we have to develop our own data sets, but we have long worked with custodians of government data, and we want to work more frequently with them because data-driven stories are more credible, they're more compelling, we can cover a much larger scope of an issue because the data is often massive. We work on data.gov. As a lot of you know, Mass Government has put up Open Checkbook, which we're starting to scrape now. But journalists, have been in this arena for a long time. Next month, when we do our computer-assisted reporting conference, we're having a couple of interesting sessions. One is a news camp in which we are going to try to learn how to put together unstructured data from video to tweets, on a particular issue. Say you're working on a story about juvenile life without parole. You want to be able to capture the entire universe of information that's out there. So we're doing this news camp session, and then we're doing a session called Scraper Wiki, in which we're going to have a 12-hour marathon session in which we've been asked to nominate a government data set, and we're going to work with these Scraper Wiki guys to scrape the data and see what we can glean from it. And I guess in closing, I would say that, you who collect government data, who analyze it, who are the custodians of it, and just listening to the previous speaker, you're doing this obviously to serve a public good, to serve a public interest. And our mission is not that different. Our mission is to improve the quantity and quality of investigative reporting in this area, which, as you know from newsroom cutbacks, has gone down, to train the next generation of journalists in these techniques because they have to have them to compete in the marketplace, and also to develop a sustainable model so that we can last. We want to do public service journalism that moves the needle, that leads to constructive social change. And I imagine a lot of you who collect and analyze data and want to get your message out about what it says have a similar mission. So there is clearly, an alignment here, and I would love to talk to anybody about what we are doing at our center and what's happening around the country, and how we can use data to serve both of our missions. So thanks for having me.
I'm John Davidow. I work at WBUR. I run the website there. I guess Ted used the term data geeks. Could you guys just give me a sense of who's out there? How many of you would be self-described data geeks? Wow. Do you know what? You guys are cool now. You are really cool. I was listening to Maggie use terms like Scraper Wiki and things like that.
I don't really know what it means.
I was going to say, I have, Ted's talking about Panda. I have no idea what he's talking about. We need to learn about all that data that you guys have access to and understand. I'll give you an example of how we use data. Actually, Ted gave you a great example of how news people use data. Generally speaking, we're all liberal arts majors too, and very math phobic. He said 20 years, 20 years, 20 years, 20 years. And basically that's what we do. We go 1, 2, 3, trend, and there's a story. And that is our version of data analysis, 90% of us. What Maggie's talking about really represents where all of this is going. So your time has come. Here's the trends that I'm seeing. First of all, you have a radio person in front of you talking about data visualization. If that if that doesn't tell you that the world of journalism has changed, nothing will. We are all sort of mixing into groups, multimedia, multi-platform, storytelling is really important. Another term that I'm hearing all the time now that I never heard before is numbers are narrative. And that's another thing that is, again, putting you guys at the forefront of where things are going. I was at NPR a couple of days ago. One of their most proud hires right now is Matt Stiles. Matt Stiles is an award-winning journalist out of the Texas Tribune, an online, I guess online newspaper, online news source, online website that has really blown up in Texas, covering political and education issues. And I'd say about 60 to 70% of their traffic is estimated coming just to look at the data visualization that Matt put together. So what did NPR do? They too just hired a data viz expert. This is all coming this way. Another example is about 4 weeks ago. A woman walked into my office. She's actually a fellow from the BU School of Communications. She went to the School of Public Health at BU and did her undergraduate work at MIT. And guess what? She knows how to do data visualization and can go do things like use Scraper Wiki and knows what Panda is. And we're already putting her to work. And this is a woman who's done almost no journalism in the past, but is now one of the most valuable people in our newsroom because she's able to cut through and make these various connections that we really aren't comfortable making, which is where you guys come in. Another example is that WBUR is starting to use it at a really basic level. We used a Google Fusion table, and we sort of did a DIY version comparing teachers. We did a very involved teacher series on the effectiveness of what makes a good teacher. One of the things we looked at was the salaries that are paid to teachers in every city and town in the state, and then we mixed or mashed those up with the information of the score results on the MCAS scores and sort of correlated the cost of a teacher per MCAS point, I guess would be the best way to describe it. And it provided a very interesting narrative, and it was just our first dive into it. I'll give you how elementary, I'm sure that sounds incredibly elementary to you. Ted mentioned the Online News Association. 1,000 online journalists came to Boston. I see Michelle Johnson's here. She was one of the hosts for that. She's from BU. And they basically used our pathetic example, Google did, on that MCAS comparison, which is about as elementary as anything you people have ever attempted, and we were held up as an example, as somebody doing something really innovative. We have a lot more work to do than that. I'll give you just one final thing that we thought would be really easy, and this gets, to Maggie's point about you are the custodians of data. I'm also the executive producer of a Knight Foundation funded project called Open Court. It brings the goal is to bring digital transparency to the nation's courts. We live stream out of the Quincy District Court. Perhaps you've heard of it or followed it. We're trying to set a best practices example of how people can understand what's going on in the district courts and courts around the country. And obviously we're live streaming, we're telling stories. We're sort of putting together a best practices, sort of the Cadillac version of it. One of the things we thought we wanted to do is demonstrate how even a community or city and town that doesn't have sort of Knight Foundation backing, that wants to sort of get the information of what's going on in the courts out, we figured that a low-hanging fruit would be simply putting out the daily docket online from the court. This is a document that is posted, Scotch tape to a door at the courthouse. It is sort of the most basic piece of information. It tells you what courtroom, it tells you what cases are going to be heard, nothing more than that. That data is not available. We can't get that data. It is too complicated and so filled with personal information. These people are accused of crimes. All of the sort of very sensitive issues, as they well should be around data, are much more complicated. And I think, more of these kinds of appearances where we are out sort of trying to connect with you and sort of get your solutions to our problems so we can tell better stories, so you can tell better stories, will sort of help everyone doing the kind. We're all on the same mission that Maggie's on, so we're finally getting together. So thank you for having me.
Good morning. I'm Derrick Jackson from the Boston Globe, and I'm a failed math student in high school and college, and but I got religion late, mainly because I'm married to a Harvard researcher. So I'm a data optimist. Over the last 25 years, I've seen the use of data change policy and society and how we think. And some examples, going back, I'm a former sports writer, so I'm very attuned to how data can drive change in sports. And data meaning counting up the amount of times that broadcasters called white athletes smart and black athletes almost animals, has led over the years to major change in how broadcasters describe athletes. I'm happy to say that many times my current hero, the Green Bay Packers, Aaron Rodgers, is often called athletic, so who's a white guy. On more serious matters, and actually, of course, how athletes are described is a serious matter of its own. Data forced the Republicans, although it took a long time, to join with the Democrats on a compromise finally last year on crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine sentencing. The data of those who know the issue know that there's virtually no medical difference between crack and powder, but of course the laws were structured in the 1980s that resulted in tens of thousands of young black men on nonviolent drug charges being sent to jail, whereas cute little suburban kids with powdered cocaine did their thing behind picket fences and suffered no penalties whatsoever. Data was critical in the mid-1990s of President Clinton's defense of what was left of affirmative action. The most important part of his speech on affirmative action was when he used data to describe the remaining disparities and job opportunities left for African Americans. In just this week, or just very recently, on environmental issues, the EPA, despite many industry attacks, the EPA used data very effectively to finally push through their mercury and power plant rule. Without that data, they would never have gotten that rule, pushed that rule. Data on, and back to sports, the NCAA this year, last year, finally is instituting a rule that they're phasing in a rule that will ban teams from postseason play in March Madness and the bowl games if they have less than a 50% graduation rate. That came after a decade of calls from the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. So it took a long time, but it did finally pass. Data on food deserts and the concentration of fast food joints in inner cities has now led to cities like Boston being national leaders on the expansion of farmers markets and making sure to the degree that low-income families can use their SNAP benefits at farmers markets. The data on obesity and nutrition has led the Obama administration just this week to announce the first revamping of school nutrition food meal nutrition standards in 15 years. Most recently, as an example of how data, a simple number can resonate so strongly with people, very recently I did a piece summing up the current science on brain trauma in sports. And based on the response, the most important single part of the piece was a reference to an ongoing study by a Purdue University bioengineering team, which has been hooking up helmets of football players with accelerometers and doing before and after brain scans after they play. And they found out that linemen and linebackers in particular hit their heads 1,000 to 1,500 times a year, a season, with a G-force that generally ranges between 4 to 20 times that of riding a roller coaster, which is 5 Gs. And those simple facts, done by people who are laboring in the dark of laboratory rooms, ends up being something that makes a parent cry at a breakfast table and makes them think about, sports and what it means and that sort of thing. Now, the thing I've come to think about data is that when data is employed with principle, it at least adds sanity to economic, racial, and environmental and many other debates that are often muddled by stereotypes and ideological predispositions. At its best, data changes minds, individual minds, house by house. If you're really lucky, it actually changes government policy and ultimately society. Now, data has not changed yet many critical issues. One of them, of course, being what you saw, what Mark presented in the opening session. Data has not yet added the proper sanity, in my view, to issues like climate change, tax policy, and I was just in South Carolina, so I can definitely attest to you, listening to the candidates in South Carolina, that it has not affected a sane debate on tax policy. It's not affected a serious overhaul of our healthcare system, which remains the most inequitable for developed of any rich country in the world. Many of you know, many of our indicators of equity are second worst only to South Africa. And it's not yet the way I look at it in closing is that data is like the Surgeon General's report on smoking in the 1960s. If you're really lucky, occasionally a data point that, as I think you said, 1, 2, 3, and then we get it to get the message out. For the general public, especially in a United States that believes in so many things that, to be kind, do not play into equity, our rugged individualism and those kinds of things, everybody for themselves. Whereas it might take the journalist 1, 2, 3 times to get it, I believe a lot, it takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 70, 80, 90 times for the public to get it in a way, and especially if it's poisoned by the political system, to get that message across. But I think the good news is that from, like as I mentioned, crack cocaine sentencing to sports descriptions to food nutrition, and the fact that in a poor person in Boston is much more likely, it may not be perfect, much more likely to be able to access fresh food than they were 20 years ago. Data can work, it does work, and the major word is patience.
Hi, I'm Mark Abraham. I'm going to mention a different Knight Commission from Derrick. The Knight Commission on the Information Needs of Communities in a Democracy. It's a report that came out recently. And they said information is as vital to communities as safe streets or clean air. How is data as important to communities as the environment that we live in? We all know the environment. There's more and more research. The environment just determines so much about our health and our sense of trust in community. Well, data is really about people, and what we need to realize is we need to build the capacity of people to understand data and use it. It's not just something that you publish and you assume people understand it. So the way that we use data really tells us about equity, and that goes back to the report and many reports that are coming out about equity now, which is probably the foremost national issue, but only recently has become that. And Abraham Lincoln said that the people who mold public sentiment, like journalists in particular, people who write, use data, they have much more power. They act much more deeply than the people who enact statutes or write laws or issue pronouncements. So what we need to do with equity, we need to make sure that every person can mold public sentiment, not just the institutions or the folks in power. And we're lucky because what we have in the internet and with social media and new media is really the first media ever that supports this. And one of the TED Talks that is really well known is by Clay Shirky, who's a media theorist, and he said that the internet's the first media that supports both groups and conversations at the same time. So the audience is not just consuming data, but it's actually producing data and information. Based on that understanding of how the media landscape is changing, there are a number of things that we can do as institutions, as governments, to really harness that, make sure that we're not just trying to kind of broadcasting to groups, broadcasting to people and assuming that they know how to digest that information, but actually involving them in the production of the data itself. This is particularly important in investigative journalism. If you've heard about Paul Lewis's work, he's an investigative journalist, and he said he's really powerful, done really powerful work with crowdsourcing and news. And he says, you should accept that you can't know everything about the world, about data that's out there. You really have to allow others to be your eyes and ears. You can't go out and collect the information yourself. So there's really a lot of amazing developments around crowdsourced news, which I'll hit on briefly. But I just wanted to go back and mention what we do at DataHaven. We're an NNIP partner, similar to the Boston Indicators partnership. The NNIP is an organization from the Urban Institute that really started many decades ago as a poverty reduction initiative. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but the idea is if you get data down to a neighborhood level, you can really engage people in what's happening in their neighborhoods, and that can lead to poverty conditions being addressed. So if people know that foreclosures are all happening in a certain block, they're much more interested to take action on that. Studies have shown, cities tend to define neighborhoods as like a 2 or 3 mile square area, but people living in neighborhoods, they really see them as much smaller than that. Maybe a mile, half a square mile area is about the average. So we need to have information at that level. It's hard to get administrative records like the American Community Survey. You can do, you can start to get there, but the more important data is the data that journalists are producing, that citizens are producing about their neighborhoods, whether it's videos, multimedia content, and the way that we can start to aggregate that and get it to people is very important. One of the recommendations from Clay Shirky in his talk was to convene groups of supporters around your data, but not to control what they're doing. So you don't think of your people you work with as like followers or people you should control the message, but really convene them together so they can talk to each other. They can magnify the data amongst themselves. There's a lot of things we can do to bring groups of people together, think of our audience as groups rather than individuals. And this goes to journalists, to legislators, and many other groups. So some of the examples I'll mention of news crowdsourcing. The Boston Globe has like a Your Town page, and on there's local stories. People can use tools to report conditions in their neighborhoods, like down to a very specific concern about a traffic signal. There's a snow crew on a Boston site where people can like see where the snow is not plowed, and they can volunteer to clean it in their area. In New York City, there's a tool called Heat Watch, which you can report buildings that don't have heat so that people can come in and address that right away. And then in New Haven, we have a gripe of the day feature. So SeeClickFix is heavily used. It's a platform to report news in your neighborhood and information, and the newspaper actually selects one of those issues every week and writes a story about it. They investigate the piece. They go to the neighbors who reported it. They try to figure out what the city's been doing or what other groups have been doing to address that issue. And it's very effective. So the bottom line there is if your data and stories are popular, if you can show people are concerned about them at the neighborhood level, I think that's when you can develop interest at the point where then a journalist will pick up that information, go to the city and go to legislators to make it a big deal. So I guess the bottom line is journalists don't always know what's most newsworthy. There's a lot of other media out there. A lot of the median age in Boston's like about 30, so a lot of people are under 30. They're not necessarily engaging with the traditional media, but they have a lot of stories to tell. One of those that came up was income inequality recently. Through Twitter, I was following the discussion about income inequality. It really was very small. If you looked at the number of people posting about this issue, obviously it's been around for a while. There's a lot of research in England, but it hadn't spread over to the US that much. And after the Occupy Wall Street protests were organizing, it started to pick up. And then after the news picked up on that, which was actually several days after it started, that's when things just ballooned. And there was like about 1,000% increase in news coverage using the words income inequality just over the period of a month. So it's really, I think, changed our national conversation. It's something that didn't come out of the media necessarily. I think it was more grassroots, more crowdsourced in a way. Thanks.
I want to get to questions from you all in a moment. I just want to follow up on a couple things. I mean, just sort of boiling down kind of what we have. The biggest change that, from my perspective, too, we've seen over the last 15, 20 years within the media is we've gone from, traditional journalist answer was sort of what we were saying here, oh, those are numbers. I can't do numbers, that's why I became a journalist, to, okay, those are numbers, those are important. The only problem is I'm not sure what to do with them or what kind of resources I have to really work with them. So I guess, one question I would have for the members of the panel here is as we look at the data that's out there and you look at your opportunities to tell stories and to dig into this stuff, what are some of the best ways to approach you with a story? So if I'm out here and I'm looking at an issue and I've got all kinds of great data on it, on housing, on environmental issues, anything like that, what's the best way to engage with the media today on that? Show up with reams of data, or to show up with one data point, or just get your general thoughts from your different perspectives on it? Everyone's pointing at Maggie. You go first.
Well, here is one thing I would say: do not put your press secretaries in the way. We're working with some government data right now in Massachusetts, and always we ask for the record layout for the data whenever we request a data set. That's what we call it. You guys might call it something different, but it's the code sheet. And journalists, as we've said, journalists go into our field partly because we're not numbers people, and we need to talk to the numbers people directly to understand, how you actually collect data, how you analyze it, how you synthesize it. And often we find that we're stopgapped by the press secretary who really doesn't understand the data at all, and it just complicates things significantly. I always ask, can I talk to the IT person? Please let me talk to the IT. I don't want to make a mistake. I want to understand the data, and you all work so hard to collect it. You want to get your message out. So that would be you know, one suggestion. The other thing is, we do our work very differently. I mean, data is wonderful, and it shows trends and patterns and things that we should report on. But we also can never stop doing the work that we do as reporters, which is, I mean, I do spend the bulk of my day hitting the phones, you know, coaxing my sources to give me story ideas or information, knocking on doors, trying to talk to people who don't want to talk to me generally. And data is a wonderful way to maybe direct the story, but it certainly isn't the entirety of our job. We have a lot more work to do to put flesh on the bones of the data. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think picking up from what Maggie said, and I think, Mark, you said it, that behind all the data are people. And, you know, as journalists, what we are storytellers, and we use narrative, and we use people's voices and their thoughts to convey the data. And so I guess one of the things that would be helpful, I mean, basically, you know, reach out to us. We're actually quite accessible these days. If you think that there's a story that needs to be told, an original story that needs to be told, that's kind of the business we're in. Even better, if there are people behind those trends that you're seeing, leads of people who are championing those, that particular information that you've found, people who, when you've been gathering your data, you want to talk to them longer than the time that you have allows, those are the people we want to talk to. So any of those kinds of things would help get the information that you have, you know, really at the tip of your tongue, and put it into the overall conversation that's going on around, around the water fountain, and that's, you know, our goal every day when we wake up. So,
I would add, it's a feeling that matching the data with people is it's actually more important today than it was 15, 20 years ago, precisely because of the plethora of, I can listen to only what I want to listen to, news channels, talk shows, and whatnot. One thing, thankfully, that has not changed for me over the years is when I get emails and phone calls from people who who ideology is contrary to mine, and they say, I disagree, I still disagree, but you made me think with the facts that you presented. And to that degree, I respond most when groups call me. I handle the environmental issues on our editorial board now, and as you can imagine, every climate change group is now like, we got this, let's talk about this, talk about that. One thing hasn't changed in news, and one is there something brand new you're saying? Is there a game-changing statistic, game-changing finding, or something that amps it up in a way we cannot ignore, we should not ignore? I think because of the massive amount, whether it's internet, the way that people can just talk to themselves now is so dangerous that as the standards of journalism and using data, I think, has increased. Like, I try to use gold standard, university peer-reviewed studies. I'm really trying to be careful about studies presented to me from advocacy groups, try to double source those. So I guess my sort of adding to that is that if you can do the data just right, I think it's more powerful than ever because the ability to freeze the average American with data and make them think differently, the challenge has been upped significantly.
I wanted to say one of the models that is relevant to this is the community-based participatory research model, which is very interesting, and it's worked well in New Haven and a lot of other places. It's really the idea that you involve the people that you're researching or working with data on, or that you want to impact in the actual studies themselves. It's very powerful to get more people engaged and really give like legitimacy to the data. Like I said before, the people care about their neighborhoods, and if you're pitching a story, if you can combine that with someone who's passionate about your story, who's from that, affected by the issue, who's maybe worked on it with you, that is doubly powerful. So we're seeing things like food deserts, and people going out researching the issue themselves, hiring like many local residents to do it. I think that's very important, especially when you're talking about public policy, where legislators want to hear from their constituents, not just a researcher. The other caveat is we need good, not just good cross-sector data across, very comprehensive, but we need really good research to back it up. And like Derrick said, not necessarily advocacy studies, but comprehensive reviews for low-cost groups can put together evaluations like health impact assessments, working with public health professionals. Those really drill down into the issue so that what you're talking about is actually relevant. It's not just like a correlation, but that the policy change you're suggesting will have an impact on the people.
Great, thanks everybody. One other thing I would add to the conversation too is the opportunity that you have as an organization that collects lots of useful data is to connect with the media when you're not pitching a story. Yep. So at those times when you've got new data sets coming out, you've got things that are going on, connecting with the media and letting them know what you do and what you have, so that when an emotional kind of story comes across John's desk, or Derrick's thinking about a column on a story that's really made kind of made an impression on him, but now it's sort of, how do I move forward and connect that to a larger world? Knowing that you're out there is a big help. And I think in a lot of newsrooms, there's not a lot of knowledge of the kinds of things that are being collected out in the community. But if you're doing it as sort of a press release just when you have a story to tell, sometimes it kind of gets lost in the shuffle of everything else. So find those opportunities to also just raise awareness of who you are and what you're doing, so that you're in the Rolodex, you're in the sort of the mental Rolodex of it. And obviously, as tools come out and become easier, I mean, this afternoon talking about the new version of the Metro Boston Data Common, I know that from a journalist perspective, Maggie and I talked about this, we're excited about it because it's an opportunity for us to sort of get a chance to get in and muck around with the data and get a better sense of what's out there as well. So as you develop tools that make it easier for journalists to help create a better understanding of an issue at hand, make sure you're sharing those stories as well, and building that sort of long-term relationship.
And I want to mention an opportunity for you. We're really lucky this year that the annual conference for investigative reporters and editors is coming to Boston in June, and it's going to be right at the Copley Marriott in the Back Bay, and it's there's usually about 800 of us, everybody from Brian Ross at ABC News down to me, and we often do have data people come to teach us journalists, what's available for us, what's out there, and we'd love to have some local sessions from any of you. I've gone to sessions with people that created data.gov. The U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics is generally there. So if anybody wants to participate and have a presentation or a session or a table, please come and see me, because we would love to have you involved.
Speaking of getting you involved, I'd love to take some questions from folks out there. Go ahead. I don't know if the mics are around.
Just a general question. Within journalistic culture now, is there some sort of dialogue between the number of countries and, say, the Metro reporters and political reporters, where a lot of times the raw data is actually trumped by nuances and paradoxes on the ground? So what you might see in the data set is not the way things are perceived or used, where the rubber meets the road. Or you might deal with a policy that looks rational, but gets hung up on the fact that the individual advancing the policy is simply liked within the legislative body? Are there people that put those little bumps in the road?
So the question, just so everyone could hear it, was about sort of the connections or lack thereof between the people who are crunching numbers within an organization and the Metro desk and the Metro reporters at the same time, as far as helping to bring those two sides together. And I'll let you guys.
No, I mean, we really, it is such a melding these days. We are all working together. There's just so much activity and buzz going on between the numbers people and the traditional print journalists. We have a group in Boston called Hackers, and we have regular sessions. Michelle Johnson knows a lot about this. You know, it's the intersection of where technology and journalism meet. So, you know, newsrooms, there's such a transformation going on in newsrooms in which we're all working together to tell powerful stories. I don't think there is that. I think it's really, really fading.
And just to add to that, what Derrick talked about, the one thing that we are still good at, we may not be great mathematicians, we may not be able to scrape the data, but we can tell when something isn't right. We can tell if we're being spun. We get uncomfortable really fast. If you present good data, clean data that'll stand up to some heavy questions and some, you know, second sourcing and third sourcing, then that's valuable data. But if you just are trying to tell a story through numbers, we're going to find you out, and we're not going to trust you when you come to us with a real story. So that's sort of where we got the gray hairs and the 20 years and wrinkles. We don't trust a lot of things that are just presented to us as facts, even though the numbers don't lie. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Maggie made the point earlier that data makes stories, when you combine it with people, makes them compelling and credible. And I think precisely, I worked for an organization and had a few financial troubles about 1.5 years ago. I think one of the things that will keep newspapers viable, the print version, is in fact, whether it's the Globe talking about the rent, average rent in Boston, as we did this week, or I'm still astounded by the New York Times piece this week on how our iPads and Apple products are being made. If you want to see data and people being used in an amazing way, I direct you to that piece, which began on Sunday. Directly answering your question, as far as I don't work on the Metro side, I work on the editorial side, but feels to me that the urgency to use data with people and get it right has actually increased and gotten better.
I have a question here from Twitter too that and I think this one kind of goes towards some of what Mark is doing, so I want to make sure we get it to him. Question for the panel: who wants to report on data collection or needs at the town level? Is it sexy enough? And Mark and I have talked quite a bit, and I think that's a lot of sort of where he's been getting at some things. So I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit, Mark. You grab a microphone.
Yeah, data. Sorry. Data at the town level is difficult, since what you need with that type of data, you need really good comparisons. If you're going to try to generalize about it, you need trends. Often the numbers are so low, they'll be kind of spiky from year to year. So it gets tough to just kind of like take a town and try to generalize about it using like a community profile. You have to kind of put it in the context of a bigger area. But I think again, like I said, going to a neighborhood or a town level, that's often much more relevant to people, just because it affects their neighbors. So.
I think there is, of course, from a media standpoint at the town level, there are, more and more opportunities at that level to engage with reporters, whether it's around here. I mean, there's more and more towns that are getting, patch reporters. There's more and more towns that their weeklies are really trying to step up their daily reporting for their websites, and there are opportunities in there, but probably with the recognition that those tend to be pretty small shops. And if you're working with the town, you probably know exactly who all the reporters are at your local town publications. You know how much they have to do. So there's an opportunity there, but there's also, you need to recognize the amount of work you may have to do helping get that story kind of bubble up to a point where they can tackle that. Other things from the audience? Right over there, you got a mic right there. Can you say who you are too?
Sure, I'm Barbara Goldoftis. I'm at Clark University. I'm a former journalist who retrained in public health and environmental epidemiology, so I can actually talk on both sides of my mouth, or I can sit on both sides of the invisible fence between the media and science. So it seems to me as though we're living in a time when there's actually among the public a lot of suspicion about data, a lot of suspicion about science, confusion. People think that scientists can be bought. People think that scientists change their minds. I'm particularly sensitive to this because of my work in epidemiology. So how would you reconcile the wonderful stories you're telling about the influence that data can have with this suspicion and confusion about science? And also, thank you for a great panel.
You tell it through human beings. You tell it through stories. I mean, data is only part of the puzzle for us. People react to stories about people that they care about, that they have some way of identifying with or relating to. And, as journalists, we're trying to combine the hard statistical facts with the powerful narrative that, we're drawing characters and we're trying to tell the stories through them. So it's not just purely a data story. And I just want to say on the town issue, you are so critical. You are absolutely critical because stories come from the ground up and not from the top down. It comes from the real people sitting around their kitchen table talking about what's bothering them. We did a story last year in which we interviewed dozens of town officials, probably some of you in here, sorry about that, bugging you for boating tax information because we were trying to do a statewide story on how badly Massachusetts does in collecting revenue from boat taxes. John Kerry's yacht is taxed the same way as my husband's little tiny sinking sailboat. And we called dozens of towns, and those statistics and bills formed a piece of the statewide puzzle and a powerful story we were able to tell. So never be afraid just because you work at the town level to call a journalist. We want to hear from you probably more than you guys know what's going on.
I want to just circle back to the question from the woman from Clark. You said something about scientists can be bought, or I would say that one of the things I'm most suspicious of is medical research. And I think it's not because scientists can be bought, but the companies that fund so much of that research have motivations, other than pure science. And I think that Derrick mentioned peer reviews and all of that. At the same time, you can go to something in the New England Journal of Medicine and read something that was, on baby formula sponsored by Nestle. I mean, that was years ago. So my skepticism is extraordinarily high when it comes to that. There was an article from the New York Times a couple of weeks ago by a former colleague of mine was quoted, Alan Cockle, who was concerned that doctors were prescribing medicines really based on the quality of the lunch that they were getting from the pharmacy companies. So I think we don't think scientists lie, but I think we want to know a lot about where the funding and the point of view of the people who are funding that science is coming from. And then just one quick point, I'd want to go back in the world of Twitter. I want to credit that 1, 2, 3 trend thing to Rosenstiel. I can't think of his last name, at the University of Texas, who was addressing a group called NewsFoo, which is like the leading thinkers in terms of where journalism is going. And this year's conference was about data. So.
We had a question over here.
Hi, my name is Qianqi Huang. I'm a community advocate, and I also went to BU, have a master in mass communications. I'm speaking from the community perspective. There's always been this distrust from the community to the media, also researcher. And my question to you is that, can you give us some concrete tips or strategy on how we can engage you to let you tell our story from our perspective? And also, how sorry, I just lost. Yeah, and because we don't have the resources to go to conferences or hire public relation firm to gather the data, whatever. All we have is us, our story, and we don't have the resources to gather data or to present data.
I would just say, often you could create the news yourself if you have access to people. You can blog about it, like post that information, and that's a way to get out the information. Once you get a few people to comment on a story that you've written, and you send it to like a legislator, all of a sudden it's not just like someone's story, but it's a story many people have read, have looked at, have commented on. So it's much more powerful in that way after it's been circulated. And then going back to that community-based participatory research model, I think some of the lack of trust is that problems have been misidentified or miscategorized, like with medical research, for example. Often it's social determinants that are important, and doing participatory research, you'll quickly hear like what the most important issues are. They're not necessarily what the researchers set out to look at, but they're much deeper issues that are core to those communities. So I think it's really essential to involve those groups if you're going to tell your story more effectively and solve that trust issue, which is, again, it's the equity issue about who has control over information.
I would also just change, to reflect a little what Mark is talking about. I mean, we're here. There's a reason that we're here. We want to make ourselves more accessible, but that's in the face-to-face world. Telling your stories, writing what you know, pushing it out there on social media channels is extraordinarily powerful. I can't tell you how many stories. We don't learn the news anymore, just so you know, from the wires or from the newspapers. We get most of our news through Twitter or through seeing things pop up instantly, sometimes too instantly. Joe Paterno, came back from the dead. But that's how news is spread now, and that's how we hear about a lot of things. So if you found something and you wrote about it and you shared it, like Mark said, and it sort of found itself in a hashtag that drew attention, or tell us about hashtags that we should be following, where you guys are talking to one another. The access to us there's a lot of different channels that are beyond picking up the phone or sending us an email with a press release.
I would just add that when it comes to investigative journalism, the stories that people are afraid to tell openly, you're not going to find those stories on Twitter. And, like, for example, I see that there's domestic violence data people here today. And you may know stories that you can't tell about clients, but you need to get the message out. And nothing replaces human contact. Nothing replaces the telephone. I tell my students all the time, pick up the phone, go down to his house. I got stopped by the police last year and criticized for going to Scott Brown's house because he wouldn't answer the telephone. And we need you. Don't call us.
Right.
I mean, nothing replaces that. That's how you get relationships with journalists, and that's how we get relationships with you. My best sources are people I've developed over years and years, cups of coffee, and they trust me because I work to get the story right. That's how it's done.
And that, unfortunately, means we're out of time. But thank you all for your questions, and thanks to the panel.